Okay, this is our next lottery video. I want to talk a little bit about the context of the story inside of the social and cultural situation when Shirley Jackson was writing. A lot of times when we think about the arts, visual arts like paintings in a museum or literary arts like short stories and poems, sometimes we feel like there's a separation between the art and the real world, right? And the art sort of exists in this sterile realm that has no relationship to our real lives, right? But if you take a look on 262 when the story begins in your textbook, we have the title of the story, and on the right side we have 1948, which is the date it was published in the New Yorker for the first time. So, what was happening in the 1940s in the United States? And does that shed any light on what might be going on in this story? I really like this story. That's one of the reasons why I give it to you at the beginning of the semester. A lot of what, the next few weeks are going to move roughly chronologically. But I wanted to give this to you for a special reason because I find that this story has a lot of relevance to our real lives, right? So I wanted to set you up with a short story, an introduction to literature that doesn't seem to be happening in a vacuum, that has, I don't want to say applications, but has relevance to our real lives, right? I think what we can do is, we can think of the lottery as an allegory for things that happen in our own culture, and we can think about that in a couple of different ways. First, the lottery is essentially what? It's a drawing, okay? And if you're thinking about what was happening in the 1940s, well, we have World War II. I was not around in World War II. I was not around in Vietnam. I do know that in Vietnam there was the draft for the military, right? I really didn't realize until a couple of years ago that there was a draft for World War II as well. And so when Shirley Jackson is writing this story, she's just a few years removed from a military draft for World War II. And do you think that there's any sort of correlation between what's happening in the story and what was happening in society in the United States around that same time? I think there's some rough equivalency there. You might be able to read this story as an allegory. That's another term that's defined in your literary terms. And that's sort of like a retelling of events, historical or social or cultural events from the society inside of literature. And so the lottery is a drawing, and the winner is stoned to death. The draft is a drawing, essentially. The outcome's not quite the same. If you're drafted, you're going to go to war, but you're not necessarily going to be killed, right? So the outcome isn't certain, the way it's certain in the lottery. But we have this sort of historical backdrop there. And so I think that's maybe one reason why this story might have been unsettling to people at the time, because it's basically reenacting in some ways parts of what was going on in the country and in the culture just a few years ago. So I find that kind of interesting. I always find stories that do those sorts of things helpful, and that's one reason why I paired this story with On a Rainy River, which is by Tim O'Brien. Those stories weren't published until the 1990s. They had to do with the Vietnam War. But, this might be an allegory for the draft in some way. And then On the Rainy River is, confronting the idea of the draft, very directly. And so I think it's interesting to read these stories paired together. So that's why I did that for you. I think this story also tackles some other issues in our society, and that's conformity, right? And that's another issue that comes up in On the Rainy River, because Tim O'Brien, the character of Tim O'Brien in that story, struggles with, whether he should do what is socially acceptable or what he's pressured to do by society, and in fact by the government, which is, declare or go to the draft, be drafted and go to war, or should he stand up to that and resist and go to Canada and maybe, ruin his reputation, ruin the reputation of his family. So that idea of conformity and nonconformity is played out in the lottery, certainly, and it's also played out in On the Rainy River. I always wonder why Tessie Hutchinson does not run away at the beginning of the story. She comes late to the lottery, right? Of course, at that time, she doesn't know that her name is going to be drawn. But heck, if you're in a village of 300 people, you have a 1 in 300 shot of your name being drawn, and if everyone else is in the village square, and you realize, even if it's by accident, oh shoot, I'm late, wouldn't you book it out of there? I mean, maybe I'm a coward, but if I were in the lottery, maybe I would be thinking about that. Things are, easier said than done. But I always wonder about that. She doesn't really protest until the very end when her fate is sealed. So she's okay with the process as long as it doesn't involve her. The character of Tim O'Brien has a slightly different view maybe not a slightly different view. He has a very different view, and his character confronts the should I, shouldn't I much more directly than Tessie ever does in The Lottery. But there's, in both of these stories, there are issues of conformity, and that's something that you can bring into your real life, right? You probably had assemblies when you were in middle school or high school talking about how to stand up to peer pressure and what it means to be a conformist or nonconformist. And you don't just deal with those pressures in high school. I don't really know what the demographics of all of you guys are. When I do face-to-face classes, it's mostly students who are out of high school, but I always have non-traditional students who are maybe a little bit older, have different life experience. I'm 30 right now, and I can speak from experience that, peer pressure is not just something you experience in grade school, middle school, high school, college. It happens all throughout your life. These are obviously extreme situations of peer pressure or conformity or those sorts of things that the characters are dealing with. But we deal with the question of whether we should do this or not frequently in our lives. And so I think that's why I wanted to give these stories to you,